So I have some slides to share. Let me just try to get, this is the hardest part usually, uh, trying to get the sharing correctly. And hopefully this did it. Okay, I think it's okay. All right. So I've the slides are up on my screen on the other screen. So I'll be looking over occasionally to on that side. So so as you introduced it, this is really a talk about how mathematics can inform democratic processes. And the question I often get when I say kind of what I do, the first question is, so what does math have to do with democracy? Well, it turns out math is really very much present in democratic mechanisms. If you really look at how democracy works, some of its basic processes like voting, apportioning legislative seats, deciding sizes of legislatures, drawing districts. Of course, gerrymandering is a part of that. And then, so one of the bullet points is the electoral college. This is specifically an American invention of electing presidents using the electoral college. I'll say something about that in passing. But other than the electoral college, all of these things listed on the slide are kind of universal. Every country has these processes, and they all really, if you look under the hood at the engine, the engine is kind of powered by mathematics. So you're choosing certain algorithms, equations, processes that are mathematical to decide things like who's going to win an election, how to draw a district, how to select a group of people to participate in a deliberative democracy process, etc. Well, once you observe that mathematics is relevant, you might ask, well, are we using kind of the best possible mathematics to achieve the most representative and fair outcomes? Because you can use different kinds of math to run these processes. And that's really what this talk is about, how the choice of mathematics that we use for these democratic mechanisms can really affect outcomes significantly. And math can also suggest which processes might be better so that we achieve outcomes that we regard desirable or fair or representative. So I'll talk about voting mostly, and then I'll briefly talk about gerrymandering, districting, and also an interesting mathematical thing, and that is how you decide how big your legislature should be. So that'll be just at the end, just short, brief mention of those two topics. So let's talk about voting a little bit. So the most common system that's used when you elect officials, and you use it in Bolivia as well, is plurality voting. A voter circles, one name, their favorite candidate on the ballot, and then the person with the most votes wins, right? That's simple, intuitive. We've used it for hundreds of years. It's easy for voters to understand. However, there's a fundamental mathematical problem with this system, and that is that the person who wins the most votes doesn't necessarily mean that they are winning the majority of the votes, right? So as soon as you have three candidates or more, there's a chance that the winner actually got less than half or less than 50% support from the voters. And I'll give you some examples in a second. This is a very simple thing that it's clear to you all what it is, but it actually has various mathematical implications. So two of the most common ones are vote splitting and the spoiler effect. So vote splitting occurs when similar candidates sort of divide the vote of most of the electorate. So the candidates who are similar don't end up winning. The vote splitting allows another candidate to kind of rise up to the top and win the election, even though most people support these candidates in a block of candidates that are similar to each other. And the other one is it's a little bit similar, spoiler effect. And that is when a candidate who really doesn't have a chance of winning, they're kind of an outside candidate, but they kind of take away enough votes from a major candidate, which allows uh, another major candidate to win over this other candidate who's been spoiled. So those are just two obvious consequences. I'll give you some examples. Then there are some other ones that are a little bit deeper. And if you get into sort of economics and political science, I'm sure you've heard some of these things like Duverger's law, center squeeze effect, susceptibility to strategic voting, etc. I don't have time to get into these, but there's a lot more issues that can be mathematically described that all say that plurality voting really has all these fundamental problems. So let me give you an example of a representative who represents the town where the college is where I work. So I live in the town next to that, and my representative is not this person, but for my college, the people who live in the college area, this guy, Jake Auchincloss, is the representative, and he was elected in 2020 in Massachusetts. So I live in the state of Massachusetts, which has 9 districts, and each elects one person to the U.S. House of Representatives. So I don't know how familiar you are with the U.S. system, but there's the Democratic Party, Republican Party, and they each first elect a candidate, and then those candidates compete later in a general election. Now, in Massachusetts, the general election is actually not competitive. Democrats always win. So that means that the primary election is really where the action is. That's where the competition is. So these were the results of the Democratic primary elections in 2020, where Jake Auchincloss won with 22% of the vote. Now we know from surveys and polling that these other three candidates actually split the vote. They're very similar. They're progressive kind of leftist candidates, but their platforms were similar enough that the voters just sort of split the vote evenly among them, or not evenly, but split the vote among them. So that allowed Jake Auchincloss to bubble up to the top, win the Democratic primary, and go on to win the congressional general election. So what this means is that more than half the voters actually vote splitting. This is what vote splitting means. More than half the voter actually would have liked to see any of these three candidates win that election. They would have been happy with any of the three rather than Jake Auchincloss. Or put another way, if any two out of these three women actually dropped out, the third one would have had much more votes than Jake Auchincloss. So in a clear way, the results of this election are not representative of the will of the voters, of the will of the people. Jake Auchincloss does not have enough support really to be representing 100% of the voters in this district. So that's an example of vote splitting. And this kind of stuff happens all over the place, not just in the US, all over the world. Anytime that somebody wins an election with less than 50% of the vote, you might ask, well, was there vote splitting? Right? And it's very possible that there was. Another consequence is the spoiler effect. And I'm going to give you an example from 2000 from the US because it's really a classic example. It's in all the textbooks now. Everybody knows it. Everybody talks about it. It's been 26 years since this happened, but it's very representative of how plurality can sort of mess up the correct answer. So these are the presidential elections in 2000, where George Bush, Al Gore, and Ralph Nader competed. Ralph Nader was a sort of outside candidate. He didn't really have a chance of winning. But what happened is that the election came down to Florida, basically. Whoever won Florida was going to win the presidential elections. And again, this is the system of electoral college votes, and it doesn't matter. We don't need to get into that. All we need to know is that if somebody won, whoever won Florida was going to win the entire election. And these are the results that came out of that Florida election. Bush and Gore were very close, and Ralph Nader had about 100,000 votes. Now, most voters, again, this is exit interviews and polling and surveys that tell us this. Most voters who voted for Ralph Nader had Al Gore as the second choice. Okay. So Bush beat Gore by 537 votes. But really, voters overall preferred Al Gore because those who voted for Nader, again, they really would have liked Gore to win rather than Bush. So what happened is this classic spoiler effect. Nader spoiled the elections for Al Gore. He took away enough votes from Al Gore, allowing Bush to beat Gore. So, and actually, one of the consequences of this electoral college thing is that you can actually win in just in the number of votes you get across the country, but you can still lose the presidential election. So this is actually what happened with Al Gore. Overall, in the US, he won over 500,000 votes more than Bush, but Bush won the presidential elections. So that's the spoiler and vote splitting. Now, a lot of people say, well, runoff is really what takes care of this, right? In the runoff, top two candidates go on to a second election. So if nobody wins more than 50% in the first election, top two candidates go to a runoff election, and now it's two candidates, and whoever wins is necessarily going to win with more than 50% because there's only two candidates. And last year you had presidential elections that for the first time ever in the country's history, I guess, went to a runoff election, and you had held a runoff election to elect the president. Now, what I want to point out is that runoff helps, but it doesn't solve the problem. And here's a perfect example. So I live outside of Boston, and Boston had these mayoral elections in 2021, where the top two candidates were Michelle Wu and Anissa George, SIB George. They went into the runoff, and Michelle Wu won, and she's still the mayor of Boston. However, if you look at third and fourth place, Campbell and Janey, maybe there was vote splitting there. We don't know for sure, but there's always the doubt of this. In other words, maybe if Janey dropped out, her voters would have voted for Campbell, and that would have given Campbell enough votes to place first or second. And then she would have gone into the runoff, and it would have been a different runoff election. And who knows what would have happened in that election? We don't know. One thing we do know for sure is that the guy in the fifth place, Joan Barras, was definitely a spoiler for Andrea Campbell. In other words, if he wasn't on the ballot, his voters would have mostly voted for Andrea Campbell, and that actually would have again given Campbell enough votes to place second. And then she would have gone into the runoff election. And then maybe the result could have been different. So the point I want to make is that the first stage of the plurality election already introduces mathematically bad things. And then they just propagate onto the runoff election, right? The damage is already done at the first level. And so by the time it gets to the second level, the damage is still there. So the runoff doesn't completely solve the problems of vote splitting or spoiler. Okay. So why do we use plurality? It's simple. It's been used a long time. People are just not aware that there are other methods. They're just used to voting by circling one name, and that's it. And politicians prefer it because if you get elected by plurality, then you don't go back and change the system that elected you, right? So politicians in general don't like to mess with the mechanisms that are helping them, right? So one suggestion that mathematics makes is to introduce a different voting system that'll take care of these problems. Mathematically, really, the problem here is that plurality takes very little information from the voter, just this first preference, and that's it. And when you give math so little information, there's only a little bit that math can do with it, right? It can make mistakes. So a better mathematical system, just takes more information. Then math and statistics and algorithms can do more as you have more data to work with.